Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pricing Matters. This is the first in a series of discussions we plan to work on during 2020 around various topics that we think are under-discussed and interesting around pricing and how it's changing with the use of technology. Every few weeks, we plan to have a discussion around an important topic in pricing. Some are more practical, others more big picture. And today I have a regular guest that will be joining us for at least a few of these, and he's a pricing expert named Dr. Ian Tidswell. Hi, Ian.
Hey, Gabe. Hey, Gabe. Thanks for having me. Excited to be part of this initiative. I'm kind of hoping we can have pricing discussions around topics that I know you and I both find interesting, and maybe get away from the purely sort of pragmatic stuff that we spend our day jobs doing and get into topics of policy, sustainability, strategy, and things that don't tend to get covered quite as much as in the regular podcast world or even in the conferences.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think the first topic that we have is a great one and one that we'll come back to a few times. So today we want to talk about kind of ethical pricing overall and mission-driven pricing specifically today.
Yeah, and I know you're as excited about this one as I am, right? It's a pretty interesting topic.
Indeed. So let's jump into it here. So Ian, what's your understanding of the definition of mission-driven pricing, or what we mean when we talk about mission-driven or ethical pricing?
Well, it's interesting. I guess we've got this continuum up on the screen here showing you going from, on one side, mercenary, bad, illegal, unethical stuff. One can argue about what's bad, what's unethical, but we'll get into that, I think. Up to, on the far right, mission-driven, which is around what is companies who are trying to do good in the world. But maybe we need to start off by having a quick look at, where does pricing even fit overall, right? So I pop into Wikipedia, and it says that the definition of a market economy is an economic system in which decisions regarding investment, production, and distribution are guided by price signals created by the forces of supply and demand. So this is really getting to, I think, that pricing is really central to how market economies work, how markets work. And it's about trying to emphasize how can we maximize profits, right? It's about how can we maximize the profitable outcome by using price signals as part of that.
Yeah.
That's sort of where pricing starts, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously it's a complex topic, right? There's various techniques and tools around pricing. We're not going to get into all those today, but just to give the listener some background that might not have it, a lot of companies will start with looking at their cost of goods and their cost of sales and apply some sort of margin percent on top of that. That's called cost plus pricing. It's kind of the most basic form and what a lot of companies have done for many years. It's not one that we necessarily support as pricing professionals, but it does warrant mention because it is widely used in many industries. And then, moving on into more market-based pricing, where you're trying to understand what are the alternative offers that are out there, competition, et cetera, and really pricing aligned with those changing market conditions. And that's where dynamic pricing comes in, and these kind of things that you hear about in the news a lot. And then, kind of moving towards value-based pricing is really trying to understand the value that your customers are getting from your products and services, and the whole transaction or the sale of your product or service is really, you can think about it in the context of an exchange of value, right? So you're providing some value, you're trying to price it according to that value that's being provided, and you're taking some of a share of that as a compensation for providing that value, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think where mission-driven pricing really kicks in is when an organization is trying to do something other than maximize profits, or maybe that's part of the goal, but there's some other mission.
Right.
So in its pure form, mission-driven pricing would be when a not-for-profit organization or a government entity is using pricing to try to fulfill its mission.
Indeed. So I agree with that definition, foregoing some or all profit for the sake of the mission. And so let's talk about some examples.
Well, let's start with a very prosaic one, right? So governments have issued driver's licenses, and they charge money for that. So how much should they charge? Well, you could You could think of it first as just a cost recovery. Maybe that's, a lot of people would think a cost plus model was the right way to do it. You could think of it as, do we want to use this as a revenue source? That might get a little tricky if you tried to maximize the revenue you could get, given that most people will need a driver's license. But so what's the, how much revenue you're trying to raise? What's the story there? I could also make an argument that you could go for a lower price to encourage more people to drive, or encourage everyone who drives to drive, making sure they have a driver's license. So really what the price the government should charge for getting a driver's license is going to depend on what their mandate is and what their mission is. What are they actually trying to do?
Right, right. And if they're trying to discourage driving, then they would charge quite a high price, right? To
They could do.
encourage people, right? And so kind of an example along those lines is speeding fines and what some countries are doing there, right? So most places have, you know, a fixed fine for speeding regardless of who you are. But you're hearing in the news, you know, over the last, say, decade, some countries like Switzerland, where you live, or the Nordic countries that are actually doing these day fines, right? And the idea of a day fine is they're taking the income of the driver and dividing that by 365 days and trying to equalize it to, say, 2 days or something along those lines, right? And so if you're making millions of dollars, you can walk home with a $1 million speeding penalty, as this Swedish guy did in his Mercedes for going about 170 kilometers over the limit. So having a heavy foot was pretty expensive in that case.
Yeah, and he was being charged 300 days because he was so far over the speed limit. So they're basically saying, you know, a year's income to pay this fine.
Right.
And you know, arguably that's a very sensible scheme, right? It's yes, it's a lot of money, but it treats everyone equally on some basis, depending on how you want to call equal.
It does, although what I've seen, and I wasn't referring to this specific one in terms of the number of days, that whether or not that 300 days is fair, I think that's where, you know, I think the idea of trying to make this hurt as much for people of different incomes makes sense. But should you be paying almost a year of your income because you're going over the speed limit? That's where I'd say there's some debate to be had. And I think in this case, they've dialed back some of this. Is a pretty old article, right? And I think they've dialed back some of this as a result of some of the pushback.
The guy was doing 100 miles an hour over the speed limit. I don't have a lot of sympathy. But anyway, they didn't ask me, so that's okay.
Yeah, cool. So let's you know, I think there's some other examples that are interesting in around traffic and congestion pricing and things like that. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the classic is, you know, where I'm from, the UK, London was one of the first cities to introduce congestion pricing. So I think it's £11.50 pence a day now to drive in central London weekdays, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. And that's been quite successful at reducing pollution, increasing travel times, and just discouraging driving in general, which I think is what they were trying to do.
Indeed. Yeah, and the Bay Bridge has some variable pricing, although it's not, I don't think flexes quite as much as the congestion pricing in London. Yeah. But one state example that we do have in the States here is in Virginia, right? And I-66, where they introduced variable pricing depending on the traffic conditions for the the HOV lanes and or these fast track lanes, right? And these actually, as you're pointing out here, for those that are following on the web, famously have actually gone up to almost $40 in some cases, right? Which is, again, you know, is that is that ethical? It kind of depends on what the alternatives are for people, right? But yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think there was a lot of pushback in Virginia. It went up to, I think, $40 was the highest price to drive like a 10-mile stretch of road. So that's pretty expensive. I think they may have sort of put some caps on it now. But, you know, arguably, if you have no choice, then it's a problem. I think the point is lots of people do have choices in the medium term, at least. And so, but any of these schemes where you do something like this, you create winners and losers. And that, even though it's good in general, it's the winners and losers debate that gets difficult. And in our polarized societies, I think that gets a little challenging. But, you know, this has speeded up traffic on that road, and it has raised money and reduced congestion. So, you know,
right. So
it's successful.
So it achieved its mission Uh, so,
Yeah.
so in that way, it's mission driven, but there's still a question around kind of the ethical, dilemma or the winners and losers, as you mentioned. So
Yeah.
that's an interesting one.
You've got to always, and I think this comes up again and again. You've always got to look at the side effects of what you're doing, because they can also, a lot of these things may make economic sense, but they can hurt the least advantaged of society the biggest. And so we've got to always, I think, be aware of that.
Indeed. So
Let me raise one other funny one, right? I know you and I had a chuckle about this earlier. Uh, Kitson Nevis has a scheme where you can get a citizenship. You can pay for citizenship. So that's, I think, an interesting value-based pricing challenge, right? I plugged in your numbers here, Gabe. So for 150, well, if you want to be single, for 150,000, you can get citizenship, and then you can, a bit more, and you can even have a sort of a good, better, best scheme. You can even do fast track approval if you want to pay a bit more as well. So
right, or if you invest in real estate, which they're obviously trying to encourage, then it comes down some. So yeah,
the minimum required by law is 400,000, right?
Okay.
And then there's some fees. So
oh, I see.
yeah, I think when you invest in getting a citizenship, I think you're paying, because I don't think you get a return on your investment other than a passport. But
right. Yeah, so I mean, that's something where obviously they have a mission that they're trying to achieve there with that, and it's to encourage foreign investment, probably of wealthy individuals that would probably also get some potential tax benefits if they do become actual citizens, and probably also provide the lower income people on the island with additional government services as a result of the tax revenue that they would be generating.
Yeah, that's right. But you can imagine it's tricky if you could have too few applicants, so it doesn't make sense, and you could have too many, so you're overwhelmed. So one would hope there was a healthy debate about where to get the balance right there.
Yeah, it would have been an interesting project to work on, right? I would have loved to do that.
Interesting,
yeah.
Yeah. But we're pricing geeks, so maybe that's why we think it's super interesting.
Yeah, well, that's why we're on.
That's why we're having a pricing podcast.
That's right. So you did some work for the Dutch Red Cross, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I did a project for, I'll show it on the what they call it, a vlog, or anyway. For an organization called 510, which is part of the Dutch Red Cross. And 510 refers to the fact that there's 510 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface. And what they're trying to use big data and analytics to direct resources when there's some kind of crisis or disaster, like a hurricane or a tsunami or flooding and this kind of thing, or even a drought. And so the idea was to try and figure out how they could do something where it wasn't just based on cost recovery, but was more based on an ability to pay. So perhaps the Norwegian Red Cross should pay more than the Congolese Red Cross for some support because of their willingness to pay. In fact, it turns out a lot of these organizations work on a very much cost plus basis. So this is a tricky problem to solve in the context of how nonprofits work. But you could argue they're missing a trick there with that.
Yeah, I mean, when you're a nonprofit, the idea even of maximizing profitability can be a challenging one for some people to even wrap their head around. So let's get into some examples that are more on the business side of things, that are companies that might be for profit but are mission driven.
Well, yeah, I know you and I have gone back and forth a bit on this, right? There's several companies now, I think, that are doing that are for profit, but mission is a very strong component of what they're doing. So let's cycle through two or three of these. The first one I bring up is a company called LifeBank. So I came across the CEO, Temi, of this company a couple of years ago at a accelerator in Merck in Darmstadt, Germany. What they're doing is trying to help hospitals get medical products delivered to them in good quality and at the time they need it. So this is a big issue in Africa where the infrastructure is so poor. So they use what is very, I think, generic, or not generic, but for straightforward technology, you know, men on motorbikes, maybe there's some women too. And then also, you know, explore doing things with drones and doing things in a different way. So there's some stats here on the screen, right? They credit themselves with saving 6,700 people lives because they were able to have a very focused mission of what they were trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So while they're for profit, I don't think they're trying to maximize the profit they make either.
Mm-hmm.
If they were, I'm not sure that Nigeria would be the place to start.
Indeed, indeed. That reminds me of another company, a customer of ours actually called Allosaurus. So Allosaurus makes skin grafts and both artificial skin grafts and some of the technology that goes around that and some other, you know, medical products. But what they were looking for, they are a nonprofit, but they were looking to maximize transaction profitability by understanding willingness to pay and coming up with a way to negotiate deals and then use some of that profit in order to really further their mission and help more people that are in need, right? So I thought this was an interesting use of pricing for a nonprofit in order to further their mission. And
Yeah, it raises some interesting questions, though, right? So do you treat certain injuries such as sports medicine in a different way than you would burns victims? So, you know, how are they thinking about segmenting their pricing? Because segmentation is always a big thing one does
right.
in for-profit pricing, and it's not obvious to me how to do that, which means it's interesting.
It's a complex challenge for sure, but you know, we were able to give them some special pricing as a nonprofit, and that's something that we've actually now turned into a program for nonprofits and mission-driven companies. So I'm looking forward to hopefully helping more of these types of companies with their challenges, and I know that that's a big area that you like to get involved in as well.
Yeah, that's right. Another outfit I did a little bit of work with is called Newell. So they're a Korean company that has a malaria detection, and that's an interesting example too, because basically the more the way their technology works is the longer you study the sample you take, the more accurate you can be, so you can detect it sooner. But the less cases you can do, and the more it costs. So there's an interesting case there of trying to get the balance right. So if you're in Africa, maybe it makes sense to maximize, you know, tune the device so you capture the maximum number of malaria cases with the minimum number of false positives, but do it, but not just be super accurate. So, and then be super accurate when you have it when you stick it in Zurich Hospital for the travelers can come back, then maybe you have it set on a different level and you can charge different prices for that. So that's super interesting, you know, how they should do that and how they want to do the segmentation as well.
Indeed, indeed. So, and they have a clear mission as well. So most companies do have a mission. Does that mean that all companies are doing mission-driven pricing?
Yeah, I'm not. I tend not to think. I tend to think not. I think. I mean, let's take one that seems yes and one that seems no, right? So Frost Methane. I think that you've worked with them a little bit, right? They're trying to.
Indeed, yeah. So that's
about them.
Yeah, it's a startup in the Bay Area, started up by a friend of mine that came from Google actually, and what she's trying to do, Oya over there, is have a startup company that is profit driven, that's really moving the needle with regards to global warming, right, and climate change. And so what's happening as the permafrost is thawing is that you get these huge vents of methane that are coming up, and what she's trying to do is develop technology and a mechanism to detect those and then convert those actually into CO2 or capture the methane, because as you know, methane is much more harmful to climate change, or has much bigger impact on climate change than does carbon dioxide. And so but what they're doing is they're selling carbon credits both to companies that are subject to the cap and trade system, which is in certain geographic regions, but also selling to companies that are just voluntarily looking to reduce their carbon footprint. As you probably heard recently, Microsoft had vowed that they want to actually erase their entire carbon footprint, right? And I think hopefully that's going to be a trend with more and more companies looking to get to a carbon neutral and maybe even, a negative carbon footprint on an ongoing basis to erase their overall carbon footprint as a company. And so, this is an interesting problem because it has a technology aspect to it, and what the, how to use the technology in order to detect and contain and destroy the methane. But then there's also the the kind of government market angle of things in terms of how they're pricing. So there's a set price on the cap and trade system for a ton of carbon, but then there's a variable willingness to pay on the voluntary side of things as well. So it's kind of a multifaceted pricing challenge that we've been talking about as she's getting the company up to help her put together her pricing strategy and tactics.
Yeah, it's super interesting, right? Again, not obvious what the right pricing strategy should be, which means it's interesting.
Yeah. So what about some of the things that you hear, like Gilead donating Truvada, the AIDS transmission prevention drug? Is that an example of mission-driven company or mission-driven pricing?
Yeah, I have my doubts on this one. A lot of companies, like, as I think we mentioned at the beginning, lots of companies have missions and they like to talk about how they're mission-driven. But if you're using your mission purely to maximize your profits in the long run in your zone, because in your industry or market, because you're basically using it to as a PR stunt, then I think it sort of doesn't. That's not mission-driven pricing. That's marketing. So Gilead is interesting in that they gave several 100,000 doses, or not doses, but treatments of HIV prevention in the US. But in fact, if you look at the press on this, and there's a very interesting podcast that will, all of the links, we'll put them in the notes as well for those who are not online. But the developers of this drug, the researchers who developed this drug, wanted it to be free and wanted it to cure and didn't look at it as making money. So very mission driven. But Gilead now, who runs this thing, seems to be using it to lock in their market share in the US in the future. So it's interesting how what can seem like a charitable donation, in fact, has a dark side to it that is not so benign and not so giving and charitable as they might,
you have to
have you think about it.
Yeah, indeed. I think you have to be a bit wary. There's a lot of this kind of PR window dressing type of mission-based activity that you see, and companies kind of bragging about how much they donate or what kind of climate impact they've made or things like that, when it's a very small percentage of their profit, and it's really more for being able to create a commercial than anything else, right? So
right.
But I have noticed an increase, especially over the last decade, really, of conscious capitalism and responsible investing, and really people being interested in social impact, right? And I love this, and I think that it's I think especially millennials oftentimes catch a lot of flack, but I think this is an area where millennials really are driving a lot of this change, and companies are realizing that not only do people want to work for companies that are have a positive social impact and are responsible and conscious, but also people are looking to invest in companies that are responsible, right? And so there's I think both of these trends are making it easier for companies to do more and to think about more of a mission rather than just maximizing profitability.
Yeah, it is heartening. It's good to see us rubbing off some of the rough edges of capitalism, perhaps. It's interesting though. I think as we've been talking about this and doing a little bit of research on it, there doesn't seem to be a very strong basis on what is mission driven. So
right.
I'm hoping some big brains at universities are going to start figuring that out. And how can you tell? But
yeah, it's all rather fuzzy, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. But let's turn it to pricing, right? So regardless of how you define it, how is pricing different when it's mission driven?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, as you know, there's a ton of tools for doing mission-driven pricing, but they're all typically around trying to maximize the profit. So when you, so we've got one up here, just one classic one is the value map, right? It's basically a value map is about trying to see perceived value versus perceived performance. You get a map and then you can work out, it can help you think about where you want to set your price.
Mm-hmm.
But if your mission is not to to maximize profits, but to maximize something else, then I think we need to take this performance, some of these things, we need to basically change these axes. So perceived performance now may not be quite the right axis. It may be how much does this help us fulfill the mission that we want to do?
Right. Impact or mission, mission impact or something like that.
That's right.
Interesting axis.
That's right. So in that malaria case, maybe the pricing should be tuned to when you detect the most malaria cases that can't be detected by traditional means. Maybe that's it, right? Mm-hmm. When it's if you have a treatment, drug treatment or something, then maybe you're trying to figure out how you can increase the QALYs. The QALY is quality adjusted years of life that's used in healthcare to assess how good a treatment is. It's not without its own challenges itself.
Right.
But part of the problem you have, if you invented a new vaccine or antibiotic, both areas that are not really favored in the medical space because you can't make a lot of money. But if you have a mission-driven mindset, then maybe it helps you. The pricing would be different. Let's say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Indeed, and I think another interesting area here, if you think about this value map, is, and you think for some of these mission-driven or more conscious capitalism type of companies like Tom's, the value perception is actually influenced by the mission, right? So when I go buy a pair of Tom's, I'm not just judging it based on the characteristics and performance of the shoe, of the actual product. I'm also judging it based on the psychological impact that it has on me and the kind of warm fuzzies that I get by knowing that by buying this pair of shoes, I'm giving someone else a pair of shoes that's in need, right? So now the question is, to your point though, is one pair of shoes the right thing, or would it be better to give one pair of shoes for every two bought, and then that way you would maximize the amount of people that you could reach that way? So that's kind of where what you're talking about, I think, requires a little bit more depth and digging and maybe some more research.
I mean, EasyJet just recently announced that they were going to be a carbon neutral airline. So they're basically paying a bunch of money to do offsets for their carbon emissions. But is that a PR thing? Does that allow them to charge more to people who fly, or is it because they'll be a preferred airline, or is it or is it really a mission-driven thing and it's super important? I suspect you could find people inside of EasyJet who have different opinions about that.
I'm sure. Lyft has been doing that for a while, and Lyft has definitely been my preferred rideshare company for a while, even before they were doing that. But that just really solidified them as my preferred vendor when they started buying carbon offsets and became carbon neutral. And
you're supposed to cycle, Gabe. You're supposed to cycle.
Well, yeah, you can cycle sometimes, and other times, it's snowing here in Chicago. So, but I'll tell you that I definitely am willing to pay a bit more, although there is a limit to that, right, in order to know that my carbon is offset. So.
Yeah, that's right. But that gets into the value of the thing you're buying, and I guess it's the question is the mission value fulfilled, offset by the the extra price you can charge. So sometimes doing the right thing lines up with being able to maximize your profits, and those cases I think that's less interesting to me than the notion of we're not going to try to maximize our profits because our mission is more important.
Right.
Sense.
Makes sense. So at the beginning, we kind of showed that ethical pricing continuum, starting from, the kind of illegal and unethical, then moving into kind of the more muddled middle. And then on the right side, the mission-based. And we've been focusing on the mission-based aspect for this episode. But I think we want to explore some of those other areas, and it'd be great to actually, I think, go more over to the dark side and talk about some of those, unethical and illegal pricing stories that you hear in the headlines a lot for the next one. So,
yeah, it's different, right? Ethical, I think mission driven is about proactively trying to do good. Ethical is about trying to avoid doing harm some way. So,
right.
they're not quite, they're related, but not quite the same thing.
Indeed. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the mission driven is about trying to fulfill like a non-financial mission and foregoing some or all profit in order to do so, right? I like that kind of general definition, although obviously there's some question marks in terms of how much. And if you're a full nonprofit, then okay, most likely mission driven, although one could argue that some nonprofits are there for the to make the founders, but at the same time, for the most part, they're foregoing profit along those lines. So yeah, I think this kind of I think is a good thing to talk about a little bit more on the in the context of the other side of the spectrum of pricing. So let's do that next time.
Perfect.
All right.
Great.
So I think that wraps us up for now. Thank you so much for joining me, Ian, and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation on the next episode of Pricing Matters.
Great. Thanks, Gabe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.